Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. It will be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your increase. So your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction. For whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father the son in whom he delights.
Good morning. Once again, thank you for your presence here, especially for those that are visiting with us today. You join us in the midst of a series of lessons that we are undertaking this year. We spent the first quarter talking about God's love for us, and spent those 12 or 13 weeks looking at that subject and came to the conclusion that we had barely scratched the surface of really being able to describe and certainly being able to understand God's love for his children. And so we used that then as a sort of a springboard or a launch into this quarter's series of lessons, which is our response to that love, which is our love for God. And so last week we just looked at a sort of an introductory lesson on loving God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, which was Jesus' answer to the question that was posed to him, what is the greatest commandment? And then he quoted from Deuteronomy 6. And so we have kind of this introduction phase of this new topic still underway here as we are entering into this quarter of learning more about what it means for us to love God. And as I kind of break down the quarter and look at the various topics or the various lessons that I want to try and cover over the next couple of months, there are some companion issues that go along with our love for God that I think we have to address, that we have to cover. Because we can't just separate the idea of loving God and look at that in a vacuum or look at that as an isolated topic and say, well, I'm going to love God even if I don't trust him, even if I have no humility, even if I'm not mature in my faith, even if I have none of these other Christian graces or fruit of the Spirit or things that are listed for God's people to consider themselves proficient in. I'm not going to worry about any of those things. All I need to worry about is loving God. And if I can love him despite a lack of all these other godly characteristics or New Testament characteristics, then it'll be okay because love trumps everything, right? Well, no. And so we need to put love in the context of how we develop as a whole as Christians. And so we don't want to try to isolate the topic of love, even though that's our subject for the year. We want to understand that it is part of a greater plan. It's part of a greater character that God calls us to, or part of a greater system of faith that God calls us into. And so for the next couple of weeks then, we'll look at the idea, part one this week, we're going to look at love in the context of trust. Next week, Lord willing, the idea will be for us to look at love in the context of humility, and then a third lesson then looking at love in the context of maturity. And understanding that there are other directions we could go with that. We could develop an entire quarter's worth of series probably on other characteristics that contribute to our love for God, but I'll let those stand as representatives of the way that we need to be growing in all of the Christian areas of life so that our love for God can grow. So to begin with today, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we are all at various stages of our growth. There's nobody here that's exactly like me, thankfully. And out of all of the people who are here, there's nobody exactly like you. And you are unique. You are in your own place when it comes to everything that we can talk about really, but specifically in terms of our faith, in terms of my relationship with God, there's nobody just like me. There's nobody who's at the exact same spot that I am, and there's nobody who is at the exact same spot that you are. And as I often do, I relate so many of the things that we talk about here back to my day job of teaching math to 8th graders. And wouldn't you know it, there's no two 8th graders that are exactly at the same spot when it comes to learning math. And so I've got to try to address the needs of all of the 8th graders that are in that class at one time. And that gets challenging. It gets tricky. It gets difficult at times to be able to meet the needs of everyone all at the same time when their needs are so varied, when their needs are so different. And yet God provides for us in that way. He doesn't demand that we all be exactly alike at every minute in the way that we express our love for Him or in the way that we are growing in our relationship with Him. He understands that we are all individuals, that we are all our own people, and He provides for us in ways that meet our needs, even if somebody else has different needs in that moment. So we want to understand, though, that the point is that we want to keep growing. My needs are different in this moment. My relationship with God is different in this moment than yours. But we both can be making progress in our relationships. We both can be growing in our relationships with God. And so 2 Peter, for instance, 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 through 8, tell us this very thing. 2 Peter 1, 5 through 8 says, "Now for this very reason also, applying all diligence in your faith, supply moral excellence, and in your moral excellence, knowledge, and your knowledge, self-control, and your self-control, perseverance, in your perseverance, godliness, and in your godliness, brotherly kindness, and in your brotherly kindness, love. For if these qualities are yours and are increasing," and that's such an important part of that verse. If these qualities are yours, they're things that we want to be part of our character, part of who we identify ourselves as God's people, and yet He tells us that they need to be ours and increasing. If they are increasing, then they render you neither useless nor unfruitful in the true knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. The last thing we want to be is stagnant. The last thing we want to be is rooted in place and not growing in our Christian lives. And so, with that in mind then, we want to look at kind of a holistic approach to this idea of growing in our love for God, so that as we are focused on growing in our love, we're also growing in other areas, and we're using our growth in those other areas to promote our growth in love. It would be a cruel God who would demand that His creation love Him if He were not deserving of our love. Think of the capricious, the manipulative deities of ancient Greek or ancient Rome, and the ways the stories tell us that they interacted with their followers, with their adherents, and the almost game-like ways that they would toy with the people that they were supposed to be protecting, with the people that were supposed to be worshiping them. If we had a God like that, who was capricious and manipulative, who was vengeful and spiteful, how wicked of Him would it be to demand of us that we love Him when He was not worthy or did not act in a way that was worthy of our love. Our God is different. He has demonstrated that He is worthy of our love through the way that He has provided for His people. And so our love for Him is a characteristic that we want to keep growing in, because He is worthy of that love. And so this morning we look at the idea of growing in love within the context of growing in our trust for God. Because how can we love a God that we do not trust? How can we love a God that is not honest with us? God is trustworthy. He is trustworthy. Do you know the story of the prophet Jeremiah? It's a fascinating story, and he's one of my favorite Old Testament characters. Jeremiah was a remarkable character in the Old Testament. If you look at Jeremiah 1, verses 5 through 10, you see the call of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a young man, and God called him into service. Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 5 through 10. God there says to Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, Alas, Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak, because I am a youth. But the Lord said to me, Do not say, I am a youth, because everywhere I send you, you shall go, and all that I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord stretched out his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. See, I have appointed you this day over the nations and over the kingdoms to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. And so here we see the young man Jeremiah called into God's service, and it doesn't give us a specific age. We don't know exactly how old Jeremiah was. Most of the reading that I've done in the past on this topic suggests that Jeremiah probably was around the age of 17. And we put a lot of pressure on our teenagers these days at age 17 or 18 as they go off to college to choose what they're going to do for the rest of their lives, right? What's your major going to be in college? And they have to, at the age of 17, 18, 19-year-old, decide what they're going to do with the rest of their lives. And how often is that really the case? I, for one, had no idea what I wanted to do when I was 17 or 18 years old. I thought I did, and went through a couple of different iterations of what I thought I wanted to do, and finally at age 37 found my calling in education. But here God at about the age of 17 is telling Jeremiah, I know what you're going to do with the rest of your life. And Jeremiah says, wait a minute. I'm just a young man. Jeremiah was doubtful of his abilities. He had never done any of the things that God was telling him that he was going to do. He had not really felt like he had prepared himself to go out and do those things. But God says, no, you're going. It'll be okay. Jeremiah thought, well, I'm young enough that nobody's going to listen to me. Especially in their day and age and their culture, we have a little different mindset, it seems, in our culture today, where maybe the younger someone is, the more weight we give to their words in some cases. But in his day and age, as a teenager, he could not get adults to listen to him, to follow him, and do the things that he was calling them to do. Jeremiah was untested, he was unsure, he was unproven. Yet he was called, and he answered. God promised Jeremiah, and there's a key there. God promised Jeremiah that he would make him equal to the task to which he was calling him. Jeremiah, I've got big plans for you. And Jeremiah says, I don't think I'm the right guy. I don't think this is the right plan. And God says, no, it is the right plan. Yes, you are the right person. And furthermore, I will make you the right person for the plan that I have for your life. Jeremiah had arguably one of the most difficult tenures of any prophet. We could talk about how difficult Ezekiel's life was being in captivity. We could talk about how difficult even Daniel's life was, though he lived in the king's court and in many ways he was privileged, yet at the same time his life was not an easy one. But Jeremiah gets my vote as the prophet who lived under the most dire of circumstances. God called him to be a prophet to the nations, and we usually don't spend a lot of time talking about what that means, but some posit that means he spent a lot of time traveling, because it wasn't only the nation of Israel that was going to be condemned and that was going to be led off into captivity by the Babylonians. It was the other nations surrounding Judah that were also going to be taken into captivity. And so some posit that Jeremiah was sent not only to his own people, but that he was sent to foreign nations to warn them of the coming hazards. And can you imagine being an Israelite, a Jew, being sent to places like Moab and Ammon and Edom, places that were their sworn enemies, and telling them God is going to pronounce judgment on you, and the kind of reception that he might have gotten in those places. But God says Jeremiah is the prophet to the nations, not just to his own people. Jeremiah was forbidden to take a wife. God did not allow him to marry, and so he had to do all of the work that he was called to do on his own. He had no one to support him in that work, to help him, to comfort him. Jeremiah was present for all three of the Babylonian sieges against Jerusalem and the battles that ensued. He was there and saw his beloved Jerusalem encircled by Babylonian troops. He saw the siege. He saw the harm and the hurt that was done to the people. He saw the ones that were led off into captivity. And he saw the destruction of the temple. Jeremiah was there for all of those things. Jeremiah was reviled. He was persecuted by the people that God sent him to serve. They threw him one time down into a cistern and left him for dead. They beat him. They threatened him. They pronounced violence against him. Jeremiah was not respected by the people that he was trying to save. And finally, at the end of his life, he was taken to Egypt against his will. When the king asked him, "Should we go to Egypt? You tell us what God says, and we'll do whatever you tell us to do." And Jeremiah conferred with God, and God said, "No, don't go to Egypt." And the king says, "Yeah, we're going, and you're coming with us." And they carted him off to Egypt against his own wishes because he didn't want to disobey God. He wanted to stay where God had told him to stay. Jeremiah was called into a life that was very, very difficult. But he trusted God. The same man that endured all of those things. At the time that the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was sacked in that final attack, was sitting on a hillside overlooking Jerusalem, and he wrote the words that we find in Lamentations chapter 3, verse 22 through 24. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Therefore, I will hope in him. Jeremiah knew what it was to be heartbroken. He knew what it was to be surrounded by people who wanted him to doubt his God. But Jeremiah trusted. Jeremiah understood what it meant to choose trust, even when everyone else around him doubted. He understood how to trust even when all that he could see with his own eyes demanded that he give up on the trust that he had for the one who had called him into service. From the very beginning of his ministry, God promised, Jeremiah, I will equip you. I will make it possible for you to serve me in the way that I want you to serve me. And from the very beginning, Jeremiah trusted. We also want to build our trust, first of all, because God is trustworthy. But second of all, we want to build our trust because the alternative is unthinkable. To give in to doubt, to decide that God is untrustworthy, is an unthinkable conclusion to this story, is an unthinkable way of looking at the God that we know and that we read about in the Bible. So an example from the life of Jesus here on this account. In John chapter 6, we've been studying on Wednesday nights the Gospel of John, and not too long ago we made our way through John chapter 6. And in John chapter 6, we see a couple of the signs, the miracles that Jesus performs, that John records for us to build our belief, to build our trust in Jesus as God's Son. At the beginning of the chapter, there's the feeding of the 5,000, and this is one of the most visible, most public miracles that Jesus performs, literally done in front of 5,000 men, and who knows how many women and children who are fed as a result of the blessing and the miracle that Jesus performs. And it's a very visible, very big miracle that is performed, and so big, so visible, and the people are so impressed that they want to take Jesus and make him their king. And of course, Jesus doesn't want that, but the people don't care. They want him as their king. And so they're going to take him by force and make him king over them. I don't even know how that works. But that was their mindset. That's what they were going to do. And so Jesus leaves. He vacates the premises. He goes off by himself into the hill country and spends some time there with his father. And so he leaves, and then his disciples, presumably by direction from Jesus, if I'm not back with you by this time, then go ahead and go across the sea and get to Capernaum, and I'll meet you there. And so they leave in a boat, and Jesus is not with them. But later that evening, Jesus walks on the water, and he approaches them on the boat, or to the boat on the water, and they bring him into the boat with him. And so from one of the greatest, most public, most visible miracles that Jesus has performed to now one of the most private miracles that Jesus has performed in a way that only those who are closest to him sees what takes place. And so we have these contrasting episodes here, and then from there, the next day, Jesus' teaching becomes very difficult. There's a change in the way that he addresses the crowds and the way that he speaks to the crowds, and he calls them into some very deep understanding about who he is. And it leads to many of the people abandoning him, because what they really were there for was to see another miracle, to be fed again, to see him do something really neat, and to maybe receive some free food. But instead, he calls them into some very difficult teaching about who he is. And many of them walk away. And at the end of that story, in John chapter 6, verses 66 through 69, it says, as a result of this, as a result of the teaching, the interaction that Jesus has with the crowd after they have followed him to the other side of the sea, as a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. Jesus therefore went to the 12, and he said, you do not want to go away also, do you? Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and come to know that you are the Holy One of God. See, it's interesting, the contrast to me in this story where Jesus performs this great miracle in front of all of these people, and they are so impressed and they are so enamored with Jesus that they want him to be their king as long as he keeps doing these miracles and feeding them and not really challenging them all that much. But then why this private miracle for the disciples? Why this private miracle for the apostles who Jesus really needs to stay with him? It's as though he was giving them an extra shot of courage, an extra dose of, this isn't really about the miracles. This is about you understanding who I am as God's son, so that when other people started leaving, they could be the ones that stayed. And Jesus here, when he asks them this question, he knows the answer. He knows their hearts. He knows they're not going to leave. But they need to hear themselves say it, and we need to hear them say it. We need to hear them declare their faith, their trust in Jesus as God's Son, and we need that in our lives so that we can have that same trust. Lord, to whom shall we go? The alternative is unthinkable. If we can't trust you, if we can't stay with you, if we can't depend on you to be who you have claimed you are, then what else is there? You have the words of eternal life. You are the Holy One of God. Jesus, we choose you, and we trust in you. We want to trust in God because he is trustworthy. We want to trust in God because the alternative is unthinkable. And then we're talking about the idea of growing in trust. So if we can grow in something, it must be measurable in some way, right? There must be some way that we can quantify it, some way that we can determine whether or not I am actually growing in my trust for God. If I can't measure it, how do I know? Well, let's look at John chapter 14. John chapter 14, you won't find the word trust, but you find the word believe a lot. And I think they're pretty similar. If God is not trustworthy, then we can't believe in him. I mean, they kind of go hand in hand, right? So the idea that Jesus is presenting to his disciples in John chapter 14 is all around the idea of belief. He starts in this discourse in John chapter 14. He says, "Let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me." Put your trust in the Father. Put your trust also in me. That's what Jesus is saying. And he goes on through this whole discourse, and we won't read John chapter 14, but I suggest to you that if you are ever wavering in your faith, if you're ever doubtful or finding yourself in a moment of difficulty in believing, that John 14 is a good place to go. Jesus here is speaking to his disciples in the upper room on the night of his betrayal. Judas has just left the building. He has just left to go and find the temple guard, the high priest, and their cohort so that he can deliver Jesus to them. He's going to receive the 30 pieces of silver, and he's going to find a way to betray Jesus this very evening. And what is it that Jesus talks to his disciples about after Judas has left? You have to believe. You have to trust. Because what's going to happen next, what's going to happen in their lives over the next 24 hours, over the next 36 hours, over the next couple of days, is going to be really, really hard. It's going to be very, very difficult. And Jesus is telling them, you have to trust. Don't be troubled. Don't be discouraged. Don't give up. But trust in the plan that God has laid out for us. Now, how do you measure trust? It's interesting to me that in this chapter, we have this repeated idea that Jesus brings forth. As he's talking to his disciples about trusting God, what is it that Jesus repeatedly says to his disciples? Verse 15, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." What does that have to do with trust? Are we going to trust God's plan? Or are we going to go our own way and do things the way that we think they ought to be done? If we really love God the way that we claim to love God, if we love God and trust Him the way that we claim to trust Him, we're going to accept His plan and we're going to do things His way, even when it seems really, really hard, even when it seems counterintuitive to the way that I think it ought to be done. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. If you have believed in me up to this point, then even tomorrow morning, when things are really, really hard, you're going to keep believing in me. And you're going to keep doing things the way I've asked you to do them. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Look at verse 21. "He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me." Why does Jesus need to say that again to them so quickly after he had just said those words? He's driving home his point. Look at verse 23. "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word." Verse 24. "He who does not love me does not keep my words." Jesus, what are you telling us here? What are you trying to get? What are you trying to get to? If you love me, you will trust me. Even when everything else tells you that you should do something different, even when your own desires pull you in a different direction, even when the world says my way is the wrong way, if you love me, you will trust me enough to do what I say. And how do we know that Jesus is serious about that very thing? Because look at how he ends this part of the story. Look at verse 31. The point that drives it all the way home is this: "But so that the world may know that I love the Father, I do exactly as the Father commanded me." Did Jesus want to go to the cross? Did he want to get nailed to the tree? Did he want to die for our sins? But he loved the Father. And he loved the Father so much that he was willing to trust the Father's plan and do it even when it was really, really hard. It's the example that he gave us. And it's the commandment that he gives us, that even when it's difficult, even when it doesn't make sense, we trust. And in that trust, we reveal our love for him. Our call to action this morning is very simple. God doesn't always call us to what is easy. You remember Jeremiah? You remember Jesus? But he always calls us to what is right and to what is best. And when we trust in him, we will trust in what he calls us to do. And in following his call, our love for him will grow. We have to trust in God's love for us so that our love for him can grow. This morning, do you trust God? Do you trust his plan? Even when it's hard, even when sometimes it doesn't seem like it makes sense, because everyone and everything else is pulling you in a different direction. Do you trust God's plan? That's the question you have to answer. If you need help answering that, we'd love to study with you. We'd love to look at the scriptures about what God's plan is and what that even means. If you have any questions about that, or if you have any need to bring before the church this morning, would you please come while we stand and sing?